Good morning, everybody. My name's Emma. Thank you again for joining us for the Global Emergency Medicine Academy Introduction to Grant Writing series. This is our third session for this course. Again, GEMA, the Global Emergency Medicine Academy, is a part of the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine. GEMA's main focus is to improve the delivery of emergency care worldwide through research, education, and mentorship. So please become a member, and that way we can make sure that going forward that we tailor these to topics that you're interested in and what is most helpful for you as researchers all around the world. And that's going to be really important. And we want to make sure that we are talking about the most pressing issues from a global perspective. So please become a member, and we would love to collaborate and work with you. And again, we're a source for mentorship and educational content and research opportunities and collaborations. Again, my name is Dr. Emma Cortez. For those of you who have been with us for the first two sessions, I'm a physician in emergency medicine and family medicine, and I work with the Indian Health Services in Arizona and South Dakota. I'm currently a clinical faculty member with Jefferson Northeastern Philadelphia, and I also am the founder and director for the nonprofit organization, the Migrant Health Collaborative South Jersey, which focuses to increase access to health care for migrant workers in New Jersey. I've had clinical experiences in Uganda and the Philippines and Nigeria, and I'm currently and have been a PI or co-PI on grant-funded projects in the past. And I'm going to be starting a fellowship in global emergency medicine at Brown in this fall. Okay, so we kind of touched on this during the other sessions before. This is meant to be an introduction. We're not going to be able to have the time to go fully in depth into each section, but we will in the future. So again, that's why would really love you to become a member, and that way we can share these with you and have further workshop series that will be much more in depth and can go into the different nuances into each subject and component, because we don't have the time to do that during this course specifically. Most of the curriculum that you see in all of the slides are based on these three textbooks. Again, highly recommend that if you're new to grant writing that you look into these books. They're extremely helpful, and of course they go much more in depth into the different topics that we talk about today. And they also provide examples and sample proposals, and it's a really great resource. And I definitely recommend that you look through these before you start the grant writing process if you're new to it. All right, so last time we did not have enough time to finish the budget section, so we're going to go ahead and talk about that today. And then we will also be talking about finding sponsors, looking for funders that are tailored to your institutional and personal interests, how to go about contacting different sources before you submit your proposal, how to plan the proposal, and then submitting that proposal. And if anyone ever has any questions during the presentation, feel free to ask. You can go ahead and put them in the chat, and if I don't see them, then we can always make sure that we answer them at the end. But please feel free to ask. One of the most important components of any grant is going to be the budget. The reason why it's important is because it's an alternative way to express your project's credibility, and it's a show of your project's value. So it's going to be scrutinized to see how well your proposed objectives and activities. In some cases, a reviewer will start with the project narrative and the budget before deciding to even read the rest of the proposal. One of the first things that funders want to know is what the budget entails and how its money will make an impact if it funds the project or the project team. In this way, demonstrating that you will be a good steward of the sponsor's fund. So they want to make sure if they decide to give you grant funding, are you going to use it wisely? Are you going to use it appropriately? And will they be able to see the most value from this endorsement? So the basic approach to writing a program budget will be in 4 stages. As you can see here, stage 1 is review, research, and organize budget requirements and information. Stage 2, develop and document the program budget, review, update, and review again, and then developing the budget justification. As a side note, I'm going to be referencing using the term program officer a lot. And so program officers exist within all foundations and all federal and state agencies with granting authority. Their role usually is to provide administrative and technical assistance to applicants in preparing for submitting grants. So they're going to be an excellent source for information. And again, like I said, I'm going to be using that phrase a lot because there's going to be a lot of opportunities for you to be able to contact this person in order to get the most detailed answers. Step 1, the first stage is a 2-step process. The first part involves reading the grant application for understanding the clarity, and the second part demonstrates how to research and organize the information to be included in the budget. The first part of step one is reading the grant application and understanding for clarity. So funders often provide us and specify a document or tool that should be used to capture the budget, as well as identify or list specific information to be included. As a potential grantee, it's important to follow these specific instructions provided. Important items to consider in the grant application guidelines before developing the budget may include, do they have a budget template or not? These may be mandatory for you to use, or it may not be. So that's something you want to make sure that you're aware of, because if they give you a mandatory form to use and you don't use it, they may not read the rest of the proposal. In a lot of cases, they don't. That's the reason why it's step one, is because if you aren't able to do that, then the rest of the steps aren't going to matter because they won't look at it. So understanding the budget template, understanding whether or not a budget narrative needs to be included, that will be in the instructions. Sometimes it's mandatory, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you can include it if you want to, and in those cases, it may be better to do that. You also want to look and see that if they do want a budget narrative, what format is it going to be in? And you're going to look for clarity around percentage of indirect or overhead cost. Typically, they can give a percentage of an indirect or overhead for an organization that they're allowed to include in their budget. And this is going to vary greatly from funder to funder, as well as from public funding at a local, state, or federal level, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I know it seems really tedious to go through all these details, but it's absolutely necessary to get a funder's attention. By following directions, an organization or project team demonstrates its level of commitment to its project. So it's absolutely imperative that you go through and look at every single instruction for the budget. So step two of stage one is research and organize budget information. So the process of researching, collecting, and organizing the budget data is often underestimated when developing the budget. Before actually developing the budget, there are several actions. Sometimes using a spreadsheet can help track of these actions. So you want to be able to identify the types of revenues, expenses, and expenses that are included in the project or organization's budget. Research, developing, or collecting estimates for revenues and expenses, organizing the data to easily facilitate the budget development process, and remembering that budgets consist of good faith estimates, a best guess based on solid research. Stage two, developing the budget. Stage two also is a multi-step process. So you're going to want to select a spreadsheet software, establish a budget period, and then estimate revenues and expenses. The initial action here is to select a spreadsheet software, such as Microsoft Excel, to document the budget items. Would definitely recommend Microsoft Excel or Lotus versus other programs such as Microsoft Word or WordPerfect, because these are going to be really helpful. A budget period is going to be describing the projects when the organization's either their fiscal year, the program year, or the grant period. So every single budget has to have a beginning and an ending period for them to understand over what timeline the funding is going to be used. For general operating grant requests, usually the program year and the fiscal year will be the same thing. There are grants that cover multiple years and thus need a multi-year budget. Make sure the budget is consistent from year to year and includes adjustments for cost of living, general service, and product increases. Estimating revenues and expenses. In stage one, all revenues and expenses that should be included in the budget should have been identified. So revenue is income identified and already committed for the program or project, such as memberships, fee-for-service, or other grants, and other fundraising endeavors, such as special events and individual giving. Other potential sources include foundation support, government funding, and individual funds. In addition, items like in-kind donations or supplies, other services, human capital, and other volunteer services should also be listed as revenue. So we're going to talk about cost sharing here, and then we'll also come back to it in a little bit. Cost sharing can be included in your revenue section and your expenses section. This can also be known as matching cost. This is the cost that you or your organization are going to contribute to the total project cost. So this might include general volunteers, donated services, donated items that you may have received from the community or other organizations. In-kind contributions are typically shown as revenues and expenses to create a net zero effect. So that's why you'll list it under revenues, because you will also be listing under the expense and they will cancel each other out. So for example, if a volunteer donates $2,000 worth of her time, that amount should be shown as $2,000 of volunteer support in the revenue and then $2,000 in volunteer support in the expenses. So this is an example of a revenue budget table. So you're listing all of the sources where your project is going to be receiving income. Some projects budget table, the revenue table is going to be pretty short. If it's a much smaller grant, you may only have funding from the grant itself that you're applying for, and then maybe some in-kind donation of your time or some of the project team's time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a very large amount. Sometimes these numbers are much smaller. So expenses, in discussing how much money the program or the project is going to cost, you are going to separate these out into direct costs or indirect costs. Direct costs include all items that can be categorically identified and charged to a specific project, such as personnel, fringe benefits, consultants, subcontractors, travel, equipment, supplies and materials, communications, computer time, and publication charges. These are itemized and can be traced directly to the project that they support. An example of how they can be listed is staff and travel, supplies and material, and equipment. And under each of those, then you would then list each item. Another way can be listed as personnel costs versus non-personnel costs. Personnel costs would include salaries, wages, fringe benefits, consultant fees, participant support costs, subcontractor versus contractor. So it's important for the funders to see how are you going to be compensating the people that are participating in the project. If that's applicable, you're going to have to consider how you're going to compensate the project members for their time. Is this going to be in kind, or are you actually going to have to be providing them with monetary compensation? And in much bigger projects, you will have to be able to compensate people for their time. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to dedicate as much focus to a larger project that's going to require it. So they need to know that you are considering this, because not all projects can be done on volunteer time. That's not realistic. So they want to see that you're taking a realistic approach and considering the fact that you probably are going to have to compensate some people for their time, whether it's volunteers for their gas, paying for their transportation to get to the project, or paying consultants, paying major personnel on the staff, or paying expert contractors or subcontractors. Non-personnel costs are going to be things like equipment, material, supplies, travel and lodging, subsistence, and publication charges. Again, how are you going to be paying for the equipment that you're going to be using, the material, supplies? These are things that they want to know that you are considering. How are you going to, if you are doing something that requires tables and chairs, pens, pencils, how are you going to be obtaining those things? You want to list all of these things, even if it's something that, say, your institution is going to be donating to you, or someone else is going to be donating to you, or say another organization is allowing you to use their space. You still want to list these as items, because you'll list them as expenses, and then under revenue is where you'll be listing that they'll be donated to you in kind from that organization or from that institution. And it may seem like a trivial detail. Funders want to know that you're thinking about these things, because otherwise they are going to assume that you're not being realistic about how you're going to be able to spend this money, and that you don't have a realistic idea of how projects are carried out. Because if you can't foresee things like, how are you going to get your volunteers to places? How are you going to get your participants to the site of the project? Then they're not going to take you seriously, and it takes away from your credibility. Another thing is publication charges. If you're telling the funder that they should fund this project because the results will help could potentially inform policy change down the line, or can help influence future research, then you're going to have to publish your data and your research findings in order for that to happen. So including something like publication charges is taking into consideration that fact that you are going to have to publish this in order to make those outcomes a reality. And so it's very common to add publication charges to your budget so that they know that you're considering that that will be an outcome of your project. The direct costs in terms of personnel costs, usually direct figures are easy to pinpoint. For example, grant-funded salaries are calculated as a percentage of time and effort devoted to the project relative to one's salary. For example, if somebody's annual salary is $60,000 a year and they're going to be donating a quarter of their time to this project that you're proposing, then their salary is going to be $15,000 for that project. Now, you want to make sure that you list it. And again, this may be someone who's volunteering their time that you're not actually going to have to pay, but you want to make sure that you're noting that's how much their time is valued. that somebody is donating $15,000 worth of their time. That's a lot of money. So whether or not that's going to be donated as a revenue, you're going to be earning $15,000 of personnel cost and then paying that out to cancel each other out, or if that's what you're going to be requesting from the grant. Why are you requesting this much money to pay the project manager, for example? And this is why you'll have it listed, because their salary is typically $60,000 a year. They're going to be spending a quarter of their time on this project. And so that's why we are requesting $15,000 to pay the manager. Another illustration is travel costs. So this can be computed on the basis of reimbursement costs per mile or round trip airfare as appropriate. If your organization does not have a standard mileage reimbursement rate, then in the US, one could consider using the IRS rate, which we can typically find by searching mileage rate on the IRS website. But internationally, this can be estimated by using the UN rates for reimbursement, listed for individual countries in cents per mile or in cents per kilometers. So depending on what country your research is going to be focused in, this may change how much you're going to be reimbursing your staff or volunteers for their travel time. And you want to make sure that you're finding a direct source for this, because if you list your research is going to be in Angola, you're saying, I'm going to pay my volunteers 14.3 cents per kilometer that they travel in their own vehicle. That's going to give you a way to calculate how much money you're requesting in your budget for transportation costs. And then later you're going to have to justify that, and you're going to be able to cite using the United Nations rates for reimbursement. So you're not just using this number out of thin air, you're not just making it up, you're not hiking up the price to get more money. You're using something that is commonly used, and it's a respected and credible source that other research projects are using too. So some foundations will tell you specifically how much they want to use for this, others won't. And so if there's not a set amount, you can always rely on credible sources like either the UN or the IRS in the United States. Other countries may have their own federal designated amounts. For example, South Africa may have a set amount that they use for reimbursement rates for travel and private vehicle. So you want to just make sure that you're searching that. And if not, you can always fall back on these more larger organizations. Consulting costs are going to be expressed hourly, daily, or on a project basis. And so if you have a contractor or subcontractor, they should be able to provide you with a written quote for the costs for you to be able to include in your budget. Indirect costs. In other terms, this is also called overhead costs. So these are costs that have been incurred for common or joint objectives of a university or a nonprofit organization or project team and the sponsored program, which cannot be identified specifically in reference to a particular project, such as building operations and maintenance, laboratory space, library services, utilities, and administration services. Indirect costs are sometimes the most perplexing cost component to include in grant budgets, and it's perplexing because it's not always clear which cost components should be included in such calculations, and indirect cost policies may vary among grant makers. So there isn't one strategy that works in all circumstances. That's why this topic is really complicated, because indirect costs is a very general term and can mean a lot of different things to different organizations, whether it's public or private foundation. Another way to think about this are costs that you can't itemize. Typically, grants don't list all of the costs associated with the project because some costs are hard to pin down, such as payroll, accounting, library usage, utilities, general project administration, etc. But these are real costs, and somebody is paying for them, whether it's the university or a different foundation or a hospital or your own organization. So rather than calculating a strict cost, accounting for these nebulous factors, many sponsors allow you to compute them as a percentage of your costs and add it to your budget requests as indirect cost items. Just to kind of reiterate the fact, indirect costs are things that you have trouble listing out as itemized costs, because say you are doing a project in the hospital, you don't know how much it costs the hospital to keep the lights on per month. You don't know how much the hospital has to pay in utility bills, things like that. And rather than trying to track that down, which would be very difficult, especially to calculate exactly how much of that you are using, that's something that you can include in the indirect costs. These are going to be different based on federal funding, foundation funding, or corporate funding. Federal agencies use the term facilities and administrative costs. It's also called F&A. So these F&A grant costs are usually calculated on a percentage figure assigned to you by the federal government as a result of an indirect cost audit. Different government departments may be associated with different fixed percentages of F&A costs, such as Department of Agriculture versus the Department of Education. The percentage figure may be based on either something called the modified total direct costs, or a percentage of the total project, or salaries and wages. The term modified means certain cost components are excluded from the calculation, such as equipment, participant support costs, and the portion of each subaward in excess of $25,000. For example, assume the federal government assigned you an indirect cost of 45% MTDC. This means for every dollar you receive in federal direct costs, the government will give you an additional 45 cents to administer that dollar expenditure. So this is a recognition that it costs something to be able to do business. Federal grants typically clarify in the application the guidelines for the specific F&A. So again, if the whole point of indirect cost is that for your activities in your project, there's going to be a cost that you're not going to be able to identify, but is actually occurring to be able to carry it out. And so MTDC may be different for different grant projects, or from different federal departments, whether it's the US government or an international government or on a local government. But the whole point is that it's going to be giving you additional funding to be able to carry out your activities. Say ask for $5,000 or $1,000 to do a project where I have a station and I'm surveying people. I'm also going to be getting an additional 45%, so another $450 to pay for things such as the lights in the room that I'm in, the gas for the heating in the room that I'm in, things like that, because it is costing somebody. That may be something that you have to consider. Institutions that have never established a federally negotiated indirect cost rate have the option of using what's something called the de minimis rate, and that's up to 10% of total direct costs. So in most cases, the federal program officer can refer you to the appropriate federal agency to find out how you negotiate federal indirect cost rate for your organization or institution. So again, I'm just mostly listing all of these terms, such as federal S&W, MTDC rate, fixed rate, de minimis rate, or because I want you to understand, at least be exposed to these terminology, and make sure that you're looking for these kinds of terms in the instructions, because they will be in there and you need to know what they are, or make sure that you're noting that they're not in there, because it's going to be a different approach to rating your budget based on that fact. Again, we could go more specifically into each single term because they're very specific and a little bit complicated, but the whole point is for you to understand that these terms exist and that you should be looking into it. And say you look at an application and it tells you a fixed rate for your indirect cost, then you can go and make sure that you look and see what that means, how they got that number, etc. So I don't expect all of this to make perfect sense right off the bat, but be aware that this exists, and this is something that you're going to have to look into more, and it's going to vary greatly depending on the grant or grant program. Institutions, sometimes they also are going to vary in what they call it. Sometimes foundations can call it administrative costs instead of overhead or MTDC. So that's a different term that they may use when discussing the same thing. So again, if there's not something explicit in the instructions for these items and for indirect costs specifically, this is a question that you want to ask the program officer. So that's why it's important to know who that person is, because when you're writing your budget, you want to look for their instructions of how they want you to include indirect costs. Some programs don't want you to include indirect costs. So that's why you have to look, do they want you to include it? And if they do, how do they want you to include it? And if that's not clear to you and you don't have a clear, precise answer to how you're going to list that in your budget, then you need to talk to the program officer, because this is not something that you want to just guess or just make up and hope that it's aligned with what they want you to do, because if it's not, they may not take you seriously and they may not consider your proposal. And this is a very common reason for them to be rejected, because number one, you can't read instructions and follow the rules. That's not a good sign. And then number two, that is not how they are planning on distributing their funds. So immediately that disqualifies you because you already are not aligned with their plan to use those funds. I can't stress enough how important it is to understand how the budget instructions are going to lay out for you how to list your indirect and direct costs. And like I was saying, some foundations will explicitly say in their applications that they do not fund administrative or indirect costs. And so if that's the case, if they say we do not allow you to include indirect costs, it's still going to exist. So either you're going to have to absorb those costs on your own, you just pay them out of your own pocket, which in a lot of cases is not realistic and not sustainable, or you can always fall back on listing these costs as direct costs. And what I mean by that is instead of saying using a percentage like 10%, an additional 10% to account for utilities and lights and things like that, you can always in your direct cost list specifically specify things like the bill per month for utilities, the amount per month for electricity. And that way that can be included in your budget and then get funding specifically for those things. It's not ideal. Sometimes it can be a lot harder and more tedious, and you have to do more research in terms of the actual costs of these things, but it is a way for you to have those things funded and not have to be expected to pay for it for yourself. In some instances, the preferred approach is requesting private foundations pay the indirect costs that they pay themselves. This would be in their tax returns and annual reports that are made public. That might be something to consider if a private foundation doesn't have a list of what percentage they want you to use for your indirect costs. You can look at their tax information and annual reports and calculate that for yourself. Again, a little bit more complicated. A little bit more work goes into that, but that is something that you can do to try to get that percentage of how much to ask for indirect costs, because it is something very important that you consider how these things are going to be paid for. Overhead costs are the other term that you'll hear, and that's usually used by corporations. Okay, so this is an example of if, say, you're doing a project and you're not sure how much to use for indirect costs, how much to ask for percentage-wise, you can always look at credible sources like the World Bank, who does those projects with UNICEF uses this. So UNICEF, for their projects, they may allow for 5% indirect costs. So that gives you an idea of how much you can ask for from a specific organization if it's not listed in there. And you can always look for other sources online, look for other credible organizations and see how much they are using to get an idea. And then you want to be able to use that in your justification later and be able to say, this is why I'm asking, because this source uses it. So cost sharing, coming back to this. So again, these are sometimes called shared costs or matching costs. So you may be contributing partial costs for things like personnel, volunteer time, or other costs for the project. These are things that may not require cash per se, but they do represent real dollars if you had to pay for these services rendered, like a volunteer. You may have a volunteer coming to help you with your project, and they're there for 4 hours, 5 hours. Although you're not actually paying them in cash for their time, their time is still valuable to you. It's still providing you a service. You are still gaining something from their time. So that's why this is going to be listed in revenues and expenses, because they are spending their time with you, which could be, if you use minimum wage, say like $5 an hour for their time, and they spend 4 hours, that would be $20 would be how much that would be valued at. You would be expending that amount of money to benefit from their service, but because they are donating it in kind, you're also earning $20 under revenue for that same time that they're giving you. And then how you list that in your budget is going to vary. So in the US, the minimum wage is also determined by the IRS. But if you're in a different country, you can look for sources such as the UN, WHO, or UNICEF, or other governmental sites in that specific country, for example, for ideas for the minimum wage. And again, you want to use something credible, and you want to use something that you can pinpoint a source as to why you're asking this much money for minimum wage for a staff member or volunteer. For the most part, federal sponsors do not expect cost sharing, but private sponsors look upon cost sharing as evidence that your organization is committed to your proposed project to the extent that you are willing to absorb some of its expense. On the other hand, some sponsors and grant programs don't place a high value on cost sharing, even to the extent of insisting that the cost sharing be dropped from the proposed budget. So this is going to be, again, something that you're going to have to look very carefully at the instructions for and make sure that you are identifying specifically what is this funder's perspective on cost sharing. Do they want me to list it? Do they not want me to list it? If they do want me to list it, how much are they valuing it? If that's not clear, if you don't have a clear, precise answer for this question about cost sharing, then you need to talk to the program officer and ask them. And that is why the program officer is there, to answer questions like this. So don't be afraid to ask if it's not clear in the instructions, because this is something that you can't just guess, make up. Everything in the budget, you have to have a clear, precise instruction of how they want you to answer it. Because if you don't know, probably not going to get it right, and then you'll just be disqualified and the rest of your proposal won't even be read. So that's why, although this can take time, you want to get this right. You want to know exactly how they expect you to approach indirect costs, direct costs, and cost sharing. So once you make your budget, you want to review, update it, and review again, and look at your budget from the perspective of the funder. So if a budget is poorly formed or formulated, it can be mistakenly seen as a project team that is not a serious candidate. You don't want to give that impression to the funder that you aren't realistic, you're not being good stewards of the funds that they're going to give you. And they don't want to essentially waste their money on a project that is going to be managed by a team that doesn't know how to use money appropriately. And that's the hard part about this, is that you can have a really great project, and there's a lot of great projects out there, and they're doing really great work, and they have really great intentions that are going to benefit people that need it. But if you can't create a budget that is clear and concise and explains how that's going to happen, then those projects will never get funding. So this is, again, why this is the most important thing to make sure that you get right, because the rest of it won't matter if you can't show clearly to the funder how you're going to be using these funds and establish that credibility and realistic perspective. Budget justification. Once a budget is developed, these are examples of budgets for you to be able to see. And again, this will be sent out. You'll have time to look over this a little bit more. Once the budget is developed, a detailed narrative called the budget justification of the significant items in the budget should be written. This document provides a narrative explanation of how expenses and revenues were derived and why they are needed. It serves as a bridge between the budget and the rest of the proposal. So it should include an explanation for every single budget line item and describes the item itself, its relevance to the project, why you need it for your project, and the basis for the cost. So you want to show your work behind how you got that cost calculation. There are times when justifications why costs are not included in the project, and it's appropriate to explain why. For example, the PI has experience working with widget analyzers, thus no additional costs for installation and training were necessary. So explaining why something is not included is also a justification and can demonstrate the competence in that what you're doing. And that way someone could look at that and be like, we're saving money because we're not paying for installation and training. And that may make them feel like you're being wise with their money. Let's see. The board of directors has also implemented a tuition freeze in effect for the duration of the project, so costs will not escalate in the future years. Another example why you're not including that in your budget, you're justifying why you're not including it, and it's showing that you are looking ahead to years ahead and that you are considering this and why they're not seeing it in there. So this will allow reviewers to question which costs are necessary and reasonable, and why a prudent person would purchase this item at this price. Is this allowable? Is this going to be necessary for your project? Is there a direct relationship between the item's availability and the project's activity, and that it's consistent? Does the application or institution treat costs the same in circumstances as either direct or indirect costs? This will provide reassurance that the costs are not unnecessary. For example, a review may wonder why a designer name brand leather laptop bag was necessary over a generic nylon and polyester laptop bag that offers the same protection. Unfortunately, there can be intentional and unintentional misuse of grant funding, which can be damaging to the applicant's ability to obtain grants in the future or tarnish the reputation of an institution. Not all grants require a budget justification. This is the reason why this is step 4, is because you need to look in those instructions and see, do I need to include a budget justification or do they? It will explicitly say do not include one. Tips, probably the most important part of the grant application. You want to read the instructions, read them again, and make sure you're understanding exactly how they want you to format your budget and how they expect you to address each item in terms of direct costs, indirect costs, cost sharing, and budget justification. Collect and record the data to substantiate revenue and expenses listed in your budget, and write a budget justification. Even if they say don't include one, this is something you want to be able to write in order to explain for yourself, and if you're speaking to a funder, of why you need these things. And it's just important to have everything itemized. This is a worksheet that can sometimes help you get started in terms of writing your budget. This will be handed out, distributed as well through email. So not all of these things are going to be applicable to every project, but starting with this may kind of give you an idea of what kinds of things do I need to consider that we're paying for. Okay, now finding sponsors and funding resources for different institutional and personal interests. We're going to be talking about pre-proposal contacts and planning. And I'll make sure all of the handouts from the previous presentations and slides are also sent out. So after this, we'll send out the slides from all 3 sessions and the handouts that go along with them. The grant writing process, it's mostly planning and only 20% writing. Grant makers or sponsors or funders are vitally concerned about specific problems, injustices, or inequalities that they see in the world. They are so concerned that they commit their money to solve these problems. They view grants as investments in improved futures. In essence, they see a gap between what is and what is ought to be. And their mission is to close this gap. The gap represents their view of the problems and view of the problems that deeply concern them. So successful grant writers understand that the sponsors view and express that view in proposals. So you want to select sponsors that share your view of the world and tailor your proposal to them. Proposals are funded when they express the priorities shared by the sponsors. Projects are rejected when they do not match a sponsor's priorities. That's why the planning process is really important, because you really want to get into the mind of the funder and think, are they aligned with my view? Say you are a vegetarian and there is a foundation in poultry. Do you see the world in the same way? They probably don't want to fund projects focused on vegetarianism, for example. And that's just a very broad example, not specific, but just kind of to get in the idea that you're trying to align your priorities with the foundations, because that's who they want to fund. They want to buy the objectives of a project that is in line with their mission. So there are 2 primary sources of grant money. There's public funding and private funding. Public funds can be typically governmental, and that's whether federal, state, and local agencies. And again, this is going to vary per country, but these can be in the form of either a grant, a cooperative agreement, or a contract. And keeping in mind that if it's a federal grant, then a lot of times those are going to be based on national objectives. They're looking at objectives that they have for the whole country. Private funding can be obtained from a variety of sources. So this is going to be your foundations, corporations, voluntary agencies, community organizations. These can be receiving their funding from individuals, families, or groups of individuals. Their priorities are usually going to be based on the personal philosophies of that founding member. So, for example, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation or the Kellogg Foundation, they're going to be funding priorities that were based on Mr. Kellogg's priorities. So again, if Mr. Kellogg was a vegetarian, that foundation probably isn't going to be funding projects that are based on poultry and agriculture. Corporate foundations, so these receive contributions from profit-making entities such as Walmart or Cigna. Community foundations, they are involved in grant giving within a specific community, state, or region, such as the Dakota Medical Foundation or the North Dakota Community Foundation. Since we said grant writing is 80% planning, let's go through some of the steps of the planning process, keeping in mind that these are going to vary greatly depending on the kind of project that you're doing. So you want to start by defining your project. This is a zoomed out view of your project. You want to make sure that you clarify to yourself that you understand the purpose of your project and write a mission statement as to the philosophy and priority of your project, why this needs to happen, why you feel this is worth the endeavor. You want to make sure that the scope of your work to help focus on who you're going to look for funding. Determine the broad project goals, identify the specific objectives that define how you will focus the work to accomplish those goals, decide how those involved are going to benefit. So for each project, you want to make sure from the get-go that you have an understanding of who is going to be gaining from this. If you do this project, is it going to be just for your own knowledge? I want to know what happens if I do XYZ. And then the question is, at the end of that, is the only outcome that now I know what happens after XYZ and there's no other benefit? Is it just me? Or is it after XYZ, not only do I know, but now my hospital knows, and they are going to use that to help patients. Or now I know, and now I'm going to be able to help distribute this to other research groups who are going to then be able to use that to further their projects and be able to find out more information. Or now I know what happens after XYZ, and now my community partners at the YMCA have a better way to get resources to their community members. So you want to understand what the outcome is going to be and who's actually going to be benefiting it. And most importantly, if you're going to have people participating in your project, how are they going to benefit? If I have a project because I'm trying to figure out what happens if I do XYZ and I have 10 people involved, did those 10 people just give their time to me so that only I could benefit, and now I feel better knowing what the outcome was? Or did they gain something too? By participating in my project, did they also get some kind of resource or some kind of benefit, whether it was me compensating them, I'll pay you each $5 to be in my project, or even for a different example, they all received a different medical treatment. And now I know if it works or if it doesn't work. And if it worked, this person received the benefit by treating their condition. So you want to make sure how every single stakeholder, partner, or participant is what they're actually going to be getting out of it, because you're going to have to be able to describe that in your proposal. If you write a whole proposal about how great it's going to be, that you now know what happens after you did XYZ, a funder may not necessarily care because their priority is to benefit community members. So they don't care that it helped just you. So that's why you want to make sure you understand very well how different people are going to be able to benefit, so that you can make sure that you express that appropriately. Make sure that you have a timeline is going to be very important, including how much time you're going to need to plan it, how much time you're going to be able to spend looking for funds, how much time you're going to need writing the proposal, and then how much time you're going to have in between from when the project start date needs to happen. So identifying the right funding sources. So this includes research grants, fellowships, scholarships, and travel grants. So I'm going to go through some tips for searching for funding. I'm going to go through each one and give examples for these. But I'll be talking about looking for organizations that have previously funded work in a specific field and in a specific geographic region. I have a short list of funders. We'll be talking about fundsforngos.org, and then Google searching and how to specifically do that to maximize and optimize your search options. So looking for organizations that have previously funded work in a specific region, in a specific geographic field. In a specific field. So for example, if I'm doing research in tuberculosis, I may want to start by trying to find out which organizations have previously funded research for infectious disease in Ghana, if that's where I'm working. I'm focusing on TB in Ghana, then that's what I want to look for first. I want to look for who are the organizations that are already funding this research, because they're going to be your top sources of who will be likely to fund your project. So who's already doing the work and where are they getting their funding? So my short list, this is something that I created specifically for this course. This is a list of foundations that have known funding for projects in Africa. And so I'll be distributing this, but each of these organizations have in the past have funded research in African countries. If you are a researcher from outside of the US and you're doing work in Africa, then these would be good places to start. This is not the only list. There's a lot of other people that are not listed on this page, but this would be a good place to start looking for opportunities that could be able to be aligned with your project. Some of them are smaller grants, some of them are larger grants. Grants from the NIH are going to be much larger, but you want to look through all of them because you need to start with small grants in order to get larger grants. You're not going to get a large, more than $100,000 grant right off the bat. You want to start with smaller grants, because if a foundation sees that you have been funded in the past for $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, they're going to see that as a sign of your credibility and that what you're doing, and then you will be able to apply for grants at much higher amounts. So again, I'll be emailing this out, but I would start here. This is a good list of places to start. I would regularly check their websites and subscribe to their newsletters. You want to subscribe to as many newsletters as you can for these, and they should be free, because you'll get emails from them when they put out new calls for funding or requests for applications. And then when you see those, you can see, does this apply to my project or not? And it may be spot on and you see it the second they post it, and then that gives you the maximum amount of time for you to be able to plan to apply. So if you're doing research in Africa, I would look through this list and sign up for their newsletters, sign up with your email, and regularly check their sites and look for different opportunities. Fundsforngos.org. They also have a free newsletter. They do have tons and tons of grant opportunities, and they're in many different fields, not just health and medicine or science. There's grants for the arts, the different liberal arts, you name it. I'm not going to go on, but there's a lot of grants, and then they may not all, most of them are not going to be relevant to you at all. The vast majority of them will not be relevant to you at all. So you would have to sift through them. But I would still sign up for their free newsletter because, again, although you may get a lot that are not relevant to you at all, you may get some that are perfect for you, and it would be a slam dunk for you to apply and be a perfect fit for you to apply. There is a premium subscription that they will advertise, but I don't think it's necessary to buy that. There may be organizations that expect you to pay. I personally don't pay for any kind of subscription to find grants, and some people may say that they do, but I don't think it's necessary for you to have to pay to be able to find opportunities. And so on this site, they do have a way for you to search by country. So you can separate. So say I'm still looking for funding for my TB work in Ghana. I can search here, look for what opportunities are in Ghana specifically, and then it'll give you a list of grants. You may, if scrolling down, say I see here a grant for Emerging Leaders Foundation in Africa. So I should probably start there, see what this one's about. Maybe it'll be a good one for me, maybe not. If you go to click on it, you might get a pop-up like this that says pay for premium. You can just exit out. And then again, it may want you to pay to read more, but I know the name of this grant now. And so what I can do is I just Google search that grant and type it in, and the first hit that you get may be that. And so now I'm just at the source site for that grant and I didn't have to pay. I could use that information to refine my search and then be able to go to the site itself. No foundations make you pay to look at their grant opportunities. Those are usually for sites that have directories of grants. They sometimes can ask you to pay, but like I said, you don't have to. And no foundation like the NIH or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So make sure you're going to websites that are credible, that usually end in like .org, gov, or if it may have the governmental ending of that is relevant to that country. So you want to look for things like that because those are going to be ones that are not trying to get you to pay unnecessarily and are credible. Google searching, this is something you're really going to want to set aside time to do. So you're going to want to sit down with your cup of tea and do a good thorough search. And you are going to want to play around with different keywords. So you can type in words like grant, funding, opportunity, global health. For me, I could type in grant, tuberculosis, Ghana, things like that, and see what comes up. A lot of stuff may not be relevant to you, like I was saying, but you want to go through and search. If you're not finding anything, you can always try broader terms. So instead of typing in diabetic foot ulcer, you can type wound, grant, wound, Ghana, or diarrhea instead of Shigella, or food safety or poultry instead of salmonella. That way you cast a wider net of opportunities. Again, type in location. So sometimes you'll get better opportunities searching specifically for country rather than just typing in tuberculosis, Africa. If I typed in tuberculosis, Ghana, grant, opportunities, I might get more specific hits than if I just use Africa. So try different locations and say I don't find anything for Ghana, then I may try typing in Africa or a neighboring region. You can look for different types of funding. So you can look for grants versus scholarships versus travel awards, career levels. If I'm a graduate student, I can look at for graduate student, grant, tuberculosis, and things like that. And because there may be opportunities that are geared specifically towards certain career levels. And so you may find that grant specifically for graduate students, which again is going to increase your chances of getting that because now you're not competing against postdocs and PhDs. It's specifically for graduate students. So it's increasing your chances of getting it because you are much more in line with the kind of person they are trying to fund. So I would sit down and spend a good hour searching these opportunities. You can always take a break and come back and then do it again another time, but you definitely want to spend a good amount of time doing this. It's not just going to be right off the bat on the first page and you find tons of opportunities. And then as you're looking through these sites and say you find some foundations that maybe fund some things similar to what you're doing, but it's not the right fit for you, then sign up for as many newsletters and subscriptions that are free as you can. So sign up for the NIH newsletter, sign up for the Diabetic Foot Ulcer Foundation, their newsletter, if that's the kind of work that you do, because again, you'll get tons of notifications and a lot of them may not be relevant to you, but you have a much higher chance of finding that opportunity that is relevant to you if you cast this wide net and are in the know about these different kind of opportunities that are happening. And then you can always send them out to your colleagues or friends that are doing research in that topic. And then maybe people will be able to do that for you too. So definitely worth sitting down, taking some time to do this. You can even put these different terms into fundsforngos.org, for example, search for that there and see what you come up with. And then do this every few months or so, because maybe there's not one when you look that one time, but then you do the same search 3 months later and suddenly there is a grant opportunity for you. So something that you want to do with some frequency. Okay, so then once you find some sources, you want to figure out is this a right funding source for you? So you want to look at the match between your project and the grant purpose and their goals. That way you're not wasting your time. So you want to think about it from the funder's perspective. What do they want? For example, if a grant is looking for disease surveillance versus treatment. So if their application, their funding opportunity just has the word surveillance all over it, and say you're working on a disease treatment, then this may not be the grant for you. And they may not be interested in funding it because again, they're looking for surveillance, not treatment. However, say for example, you're working on that disease, a diagnostic tool for that disease. You could potentially persuade them that your diagnostic tool is relevant to surveillance. So that's why you really want to take a good look at it and look at what is it that they're actually trying to do. And that way you can see, can I persuade them that what I'm doing is similar to what they're doing, or is there no chance? Another example would be a lot of grants can be things for healthcare versus health technologies. So healthcare typically means like clinic work, and health technologies can be more healthcare innovations, or it's going to be different than how healthcare is delivered in the clinic. So you want to look closely to how they're wording it and make sure that you're not misinterpreting it and that you don't propose a project that they won't have any interest in. Because if a company is interested in looking for health technologies, for example, and your project is about trying to do mobile healthcare so you can bring the care you normally do to more patients, not the same thing as developing a new technology or innovation. You're not using anything new, you're just doing it mobily. So it's not the same thing. So that's why you really want to make sure that you really understand what it is they're actually looking for. And if you're not sure, you can either ask the program director or ask somebody else, send it to them and be like, what do you think that they're looking for? And they might be able to kind of help you tease that out. Look at past projects they funded in the past. So that same foundation, you can look, usually they will all have on their previous winners of their grants. Look at those projects. See, is that similar to mine? Is it not? If it's nothing like yours, all of the winners have projects that are nothing to do with yours, then that's probably not the grant for you. If maybe one or two of them are similar to what you do, then you do have a chance at being able to, you clearly have a chance to persuade the funder that your project is right because other projects similar to yours have done it in the past. So it's really important to look at that before you take the time to sit and write the proposal, because it will really make a difference. And again, if you're not sure whether or not this is something that a foundation would be interested in funding at all, you can always contact the program officer and ask them. So again, they're there for you to be used and ask questions. So don't be afraid to ask them questions, but make sure that you send them very concise, short emails, because they probably are getting a lot of emails. And so you want to make sure that you're direct and to the point. Hello, my name is so-and-so. I can see that this opportunity is an amazing opportunity. Would the Kellogg Foundation be interested in funding a project in XYZ? Keep it short and sweet. And then they could say like, why, absolutely, blah, blah, blah. And it really kind of opens the door between you and that sponsor. Or if not, they say, no, it's not really what we're looking for. Then that saves you the time of writing the proposal and tailoring to them when they're never going to have an interest in funding that. So say you find somebody who is a good match for you, then you want to start making direct contact with them. So starting with the project officer is a good way to do that. You can ask them questions. You are going to want to make sure that you're talking to multiple people. So successful grant writers know that it's important to gather information from multiple sources, beginning with the program officer. So making initial contact with the program officer, it's important for two reasons, because you are obtaining the information that you need about the program, and then also you are establishing that relationship between your project and the program officer so that they know who you are. They get an idea, they're starting to become familiar with you. But if you do this, make sure that you are having specific questions and you're not wasting their time asking questions that are already explained on the website, because that can just be annoying for some people. You don't want to annoy them. You don't want them to have a negative attitude towards you before you even submitted your proposal. Contact past winners of the grant. So on that website, if it has a list of previous winners, you can always try to reach out to those people that were previously funded, because obviously they did something right for their proposal to be funded. So you can talk to them and see what about their project was successful and why it was funded for those reasons. But you're not going to be asking them for feedback on your proposal, but rather try to get an idea of why their proposal did work and see if those helpful hints can be applied to your project. I know it's kind of hard talking to someone you've never met before and has no idea about your work, but just starting off by who you are, why you're contacting them, and why having this conversation would benefit them in any way, because they're not going to want to waste their time. You could say something like, I saw that your project was recently funded. Our project may dovetail with yours, and we may be able to collaborate and help your project. Please let me know if you have some time to talk. And then that way they would give them an incentive to talk to you, and they would take the time to talk to you. Because if you say, hi, my name is Emma, will you look at my project and let me know if you think I would win too? These could be very busy people. They might not respond. So you want to make sure you're doing it in a way that may be beneficial to them. So for example, hi, I'm Dr. Tom Brown. I work at the Midwest Hospital in Emergency Medicine. I see you were the recent winner of the Polaris Community Health Grant in Emergent Care. The reason I'm contacting you is because there's a chance that my research team's project might dovetail with your project. If you possibly have time, I would like to get a brief update on your project, explore the possible link between our projects, and learn more about your experience with the Polaris Community Health. Thank you so much. So something short and sweet like that may be able to prompt more communication, whether it's through email or a phone call, between you and the past winner. And that way you kind of get a chance to let them talk about their experiences, see what pitfalls they had, see what major disappointments they've had now that they get the funding. And that's really going to help you it can make you make a decision. Maybe you don't want to apply to this person. So you can ask them questions like, how close was your initial budget to the awarded amount? Did this person get a lot less than they applied for? Did they have a relationship with the sponsor before they applied? They may say, I've known that person for years. I've been working with this foundation for 20 years. That's going to give you an idea that maybe they don't award people larger amounts right away until they have a much stronger relationship with them. Or if they say, no, I saw it on their website and I applied and I got the funding, that's going to be the positive thing. And you can see that as a reason that you should apply, and that could be encouraging. You can ask them questions about whether or not the sponsor had a preference for internal versus external evaluations, what are their major hurdles, and just listen. Again, you want to hear more about their project. You're not going to be explaining to them a lot about your project. You mostly want to hear what they have to say and see if any of that can be helpful. Some people may contact past grant reviewers for a certain opportunity. That's not always possible, but if that is something that you are able to do, then you may want to take that opportunity, because sometimes reviewers, what it is they were looking for when they were looking at the projects, what they did not want from the projects. Maybe sometimes they have a rubric that they score the projects on, and so they could like something like that. And then you want to follow up with the program officer. So thank them. You ask them a basic question and they respond to you. Make sure that you thank them for taking the time to answer you, and then follow up with any other questions after that. If you have some more questions that are not explained in the instructions, take that opportunity and continue building that relationship. Make sure you acquire all of the guidelines. Again, incredibly important. So you want to know when the deadline is, who is eligible, how they want it formatted, review their timetable. When do they expect the project to start? When do they expect the project to finish? Their budgets. I'm not going to beat a dead horse, but super important. What their goals are, their different award levels, and then who to contact. Now, and the reason why I'm saying this is important, because if you look at the eligibility, some projects may seem like maybe they are going to be able to be funded in your area, but then you look at the eligibility and they say, we only fund researchers from the US that are doing research in Ghana, or we only fund researchers that are residents of Ghana doing research in Ghana. So that's a big difference, because that may make or break your ability to be eligible for an award. So make sure that you read those things very specifically. Read them and then read them again. So exactly like I said, you just want to make sure you go through all of the requirements with a fine-tooth comb, because don't waste your time applying for a proposal that you were never going to be able to get. So it's highly important to do that and to make sure that what it is that they want. So that will kind of help you start strategizing how you're planning your proposal from the funder's perspective. So most of the foundations will have a theme, and so you can tailor the same project. Say my same project about tuberculosis in Ghana, I can tailor that same project to different foundations depending on the theme of what they're trying to fund. Say there's a foundation that focuses on disease that are affecting children specifically. I can take my project and describe how tuberculosis is affecting children in a certain region, and then kind of focus that proposal about how is it affecting children, how is this project going to help that? How are we going to address that? What benefit will the children receive from this project going forward in the future? Things like that. And then that would make that be more in line with what they're looking for, and then they would be willing to fund that. Meanwhile, if there's another grant that's for diseases affecting women, I can talk about how tuberculosis is affecting women and mothers, and you again tailor that to that concern. And then you may potentially win funding from both foundations, and now that is benefiting you to expand and scale up your project. So just look at the different themes, look at what they're looking for. Again, you could tailor that same project to capacity building. Let's look at how we can improve the capacity of research in tuberculosis that you're already doing, and then use the funds specifically for that. So not one size does not fit all, and every single grant that you write, no matter what the project is, even if it's for the same project every single time, you want to tailor it exactly to what that funder is looking for and what their goals and priorities are. Understand what they know and what they don't know. So if, say, there's a tuberculosis foundation, that's all they focus on is tuberculosis, then when I write my proposal, I'm not going to spend a ton of time explaining what tuberculosis is, how it affects the body, how it affects the lungs, because they already know that, and it'll be a waste of their time. And also, you may have a limit on how many pages you can use, and you don't want to spend too much of that time talking about something they already know. So, but if it's a foundation that focuses on pediatric health, then that is an audience that you would want to explain more about tuberculosis and what it is, how it affects children, things like that. So you really want to spend more of your text that you have on what they don't know rather than what they know. You want to outline your proposal based on the specific theme before you start writing it. So create that outline. If I'm gearing my project toward children, tuberculosis in children, I'm going to write my outline based on how every single component that I'm doing is focused on the pediatric component of the pediatric patients. And then if I'm writing another grant for how tuberculosis in women and mothers, I'm going to write another outline that goes through and make sure I know how each component is going to be focused on women. So my problem statement is going to be more focused about women and the problem with tuberculosis in women. My activities are going to be focused on women and how it's going to address women. My outcomes are going to be focused on women. Whereas my proposal for my pediatric tuberculosis project. My problem statement has to be focused on tuberculosis in children, how my activities are going to address pediatric patients specifically. So go through make an outline for how your project is going to address that specific theme every single time you do it. And that way, as you're writing your proposal, it will help keep you on track to make sure that what it is you're supposed to be focusing on and not lose focus. Know the submission deadline. You want to make sure you apply as early as possible. This will give an idea of whether or not you can actually be realistic about getting this in on time and whether or not your project is going to fit. If you submit the deadline is say in end of February and they expect your project to start March 1st, you may not be eligible for that because your project may need time to get consultants in order, like to order supplies, to gather the right amount of participants. And so that's not going to be a realistic deadline for you. Or the opposite, they don't expect your project to start until 2025 and you're going to graduate from that institution and you're not going to be there anymore, then that may not be an appropriate grant for you to apply to at that moment. So sometimes funders have policies on late submissions or exceptions or mail delays. So say you mail it out before the deadline and it doesn't get there, you want to make sure what their policy is on that, whether or not they'll accept it or not. And then figure out how you're going to be notified about whether or not they received your proposal or not. Determine your own personal needs. So make sure that you take the time to find your project consultant, other personnel, the equipment you're going to need, negotiate compensation. So you make sure that you have in your budget the exact compensation you're going to be paying somebody. So these are things you're going to need to have time to work out so that your budget is perfect for when you submit it. So I'm not going to, if the application is due tomorrow, I'm not going to have enough time to call my staff members and say like, hey, would you be able to be working for this much money? Hey, can you do this? Can you work for me as a contractor for $125 an hour? And I'm not going to have enough time to do all of that and write my proposal and plan everything by tomorrow. So it's really something you need to give yourself a lot of time to plan for. So you're looking at these deadlines for these grant opportunities that you're finding and seeing, will I have enough time to plan appropriately? Create a timeline. So make a schedule for yourself that will show you how much time do I have to make multiple drafts? How much time do I have to plan? How much time do I have for people to be able to read and edit it? If I emailed 5 people right now and said, hey, can you read my proposal? It's due tomorrow. It's a much lower likelihood that people are going to be able to have that time to be able to do that. So you want to make sure you have enough time to have that reviewed by other people. Start early. Some grants can take up to 8 months to be able to fully plan and write the proposal. So keep that in mind. Not all of them. Smaller grants may take a lot less time, but just make sure that you're aware and you give yourself the right amount of time submitting the proposal. So when you submit it, you want to highlight your main points, be concise and easily understood. Don't use too many words. If you can explain it in a very short sentence, you want to be direct and to the point, simple and to the point. You always want to keep in mind. You want to reread your sentences. Does this sentence say exactly what it is I'm trying to say? And can it be shortened? You don't want to repeat the same sentence over and over again through the proposal. So you can always try and rephrase it and keep it interesting for your reviewer to read. Double check your spelling and your grammar. Super important. That's why you need to have other people read your proposal. Especially if it's in English, because this can be different in different countries. So if you can have other people that speak different languages than you read it, say your friend is bilingual, them reading it, if English is their second language, that may be helpful for them to read it, because if they say, I don't understand this sentence, as someone who English is my second language, you may want to rewrite that phrase so it's more understandable. Make sure you're not plagiarizing. If you can't find another way to say something, then you can always put quotes in it and cite it specifically. That's the standardized way of doing it. Make sure what dates you're expecting to be notified by. Write thank you notes to program officers, whether you're funded or not, because although you may not have gotten that grant, if you have a good relationship, say they really liked you and they liked your project, but they couldn't fund it for a couple of reasons. If you apply to their next grant, they may be like, well, this one will work. Like, we like this person. We do want to give them this opportunity, and they know you and they know that you are already doing work, and they're saying like, now this person has had more time to plan. So it's worth it to keep those relationships open, and you want to build on those relationships. You want to make sure you read the notice of grant award carefully. If it's not funded, you can ask for feedback, like, why wasn't my project funded? And they can say, well, your timeline wasn't realistic. And that way you can change it and then apply to their next grant. Sometimes I know even some major foundations do this. They'll allow you to rewrite it and then resubmit it. So if it's not funded, find out if you can find out why, do that, and then either try to resubmit it or plan it for their next cycle of awards. And then keep looking for other funding options. So this is a long-term game. Grant writing is a marathon. And if you plan on incorporating this in your career, it's a very long road. And so most people, plenty of researchers are rejected their first 3 or 4 times before they get an acceptance of a grant. That's not uncommon. So if that happens to you, don't let that discourage you. That's pretty normal, and just keep trying, because the more you do it, the more likely you're going to succeed. And then when you start getting those smaller grants, even for like dollars, $100, things like that, that starts building your track record and then makes you more eligible for more like higher grant awards going forward. So keep that in mind. And then some foundations, their success rates vary dramatically amongst themselves. So some foundations they only fund 1% of their solicited programs. And another foundation, they fund 85% of their proposals. So just because you get a rejection doesn't mean that your work isn't good. It means that you have to look, and was there a problem with your proposal? Is it the foundation that they just don't fund that many programs? You want to have those realistic expectations and keep trying. It just, no matter what, just keep trying, because the work that you're doing matters. And I know so many of you are doing really amazing work all around the world. And if you could have the most amazing project ever, but if you can't, doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be funded unless you get all of these components in order, but doesn't mean it's not worth it. And it doesn't mean that your work isn't worthy. So keep trying and keep doing what you're doing and keep fighting the good fight. So that's the end of this session. I know we're way over time, but please, please, please become a member of GMA and SAEM. We're going to have more workshops on grant writing. We're going to have more series that we're going specifically in depth into the budget, that we can go into like all the nitty gritty of direct costs, indirect costs, cost sharing, how you get those numbers, what the numbers are going to look like in this country versus another country, because we have much more time to dedicate to that. There's going to be presentations on and workshops on how to write a scientific paper. What do you do with your data once you get it? How are you going to communicate those findings? And so there's going to be a series on scientific papers. So you're going to want to check that out. And furthermore, GMA is a community of researchers in emergency medicine. And so we can be a source for mentorship and collaboration. So we are always looking for more people to collaborate with, and we want to learn from you as much as we are able to provide educational content as well. So it's super vital for GMA to be able to have as many diverse members from all over the world as possible in order for us to be able to advance global emergency medicine. So please, I'm going to put the links for SAEM in the chat. So please check that out. And that way we can keep doing this together. So thank you so much for joining us. This is my email. If you have any questions at all, please email me. Like I said, I'm going to make sure that we send out the slides and the handouts to the emails of who have signed up. So keep an eye out for that. Are there any questions? As I'm looking for this, feel free to unmute yourself to ask a question. And please look forward into GMA. We really, really love to have, and you are who we are looking for to collaborate with and to serve and to learn from. So if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to hear from you. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a good day.